Hey friends, it's Jimmy, kindly asking you to hit the notification bell and both the like and subscribe buttons before we start. Hitting that notification bell is actually the most surefire way to ensure my new videos end up on your homepage. Also, don't forget to leave a comment, since this really helps my video go out to a wider audience and ensures that I can keep producing historical content. History doesn't always turn on a battlefield. Sometimes it turns on a single fateful moment of bad luck. For England, that moment may have come in 1064 on the storm-tossed waters of the English Channel. On board a ship was Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, brother-in-law to the king, and by far the most powerful man in the kingdom. We don't know for certain why he was sailing, though it's been speculated that he may have been on a diplomatic mission. Whatever his purpose, it was cut short by a violent squall. The ship was blown hopelessly off course, smashing onto the shores of Ponthieu, a small but hostile territory ruled by Count Guy. Harold, the most powerful man in England, was dragged from the surf and taken prisoner. The Count seized him based on the laws of wreck, a brutal custom that essentially made any valuable cargo, or person, washed ashore the property of the local lord. Harold was thrown into a dungeon at Boran, a prisoner to be ransomed. Word of this prize spread quickly. To the south in Normandy, Duke William heard the news. William, a ruthless and ambitious ruler, immediately saw his opportunity. William dispatched messengers, applied a heavy dose of threats, and demanded that the Count hand Harold over. The Count, who was also a vassal of the French king, was cowed by his powerful Norman neighbor and had absolutely no choice but to comply. Harold was quote-unquote rescued from this prison, only to be delivered into the hands of a far more dangerous man. Godwinson was now the guest of Duke William of Normandy, whether he liked it or not. William was a master political operator. He knew he couldn't just keep Harold in a dungeon as his previous captor had done. He treated Harold not as a prisoner, but as a guest of honor, at least the same way that a turkey might be called the guest of honor at a Thanksgiving dinner. He invited Harold to join him on a military campaign into neighboring Brittany against Duke Conan. During this campaign, Harold, a renowned warrior in his own right, proved his worth. In a famous scene, immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry, two of William's soldiers were trapped in the quicksand near the fortress of Mont Saint-Michel. It was Harold who waded in, reportedly pulling both men to safety with his bare hands. After they successfully besieged Duke Conan at Dinan, William celebrated his guest as a brother in arms. He presented Harold with gifts of weapons and armor, a public and deeply symbolic act. In the 11th century feudal world, this was no simple gesture. A lord gave arms to his vassal. William was, in full view of his court, maneuvering Harold into a subordinate role, creating a public spectacle of obligation. This carefully constructed friendship was the backdrop for William's real goal. But to understand how he used it, we must fast forward 2 years to the event that set all of England on fire, January 5th, 1066. King Edward the Confessor, old and childless, died. His death created a power vacuum, a succession crisis that would pit various claimants against each other for the English crown. On January 6, 1066, the day after Edward's death, England's leading nobles and bishops convened the Witenagemot, the Great Council of the realm. Their job wasn't to automatically follow a line of succession, but to elect the man best suited to defend the kingdom. The obvious choice was Harold Godwinson. He was the wealthiest, most powerful, and most respected military leader in England. According to contemporary Anglo-Saxon sources, Edward even made it clear that he viewed Godwinson as his natural successor, a non-determinative factor to be considered. The council elected Harold Godwinson, and he was crowned king in Westminster Abbey, likely on the same day. When the news reached Normandy, William was reportedly enraged. He claimed he was the rightful king, citing a supposed promise Edward had made to him back in 1051. But William knew that a vague 15-year-old promise wasn't enough to justify a full-scale invasion. He needed something more potent, a moral and religious justification, a casus belli. And he found it in Harold's visit of 1064. William's claim was that Harold wasn't a king, but a usurper, and worse, a perjurer, an oath-breaker. The Norman narrative, likely only fully crafted after Harold had been elected king, was extremely simple and easy to understand. During his time as William's guest of honor, Harold had allegedly sworn a sacred oath, on holy relics, to support William's claim to the English throne. By accepting the crown from the council, Harold had therefore violated this sacred vow, damning his own soul and forfeiting his right to rule. This claim of a broken oath became the central pillar of the entire Norman justification for the conflict, and they documented it in one of the most brilliant and biased works of art in history, the Bayeux Tapestry. The tapestry's climax before the battle itself is the oath scene. We see Harold, looking uncomfortable, standing between two large reliquary shrines, his hands placed upon them. The Latin inscription above reads, translated into English, "Harold made an oath to Duke William." The tapestry, however, is conveniently silent on what he swore, or why. For those details, we must turn to the Norman chroniclers, men like William of Poitiers, William's personal chaplain, and William of Jumièges. Writing to legitimize their patron's new regime, they provided the full details that couldn't be fit on a piece of fabric. Later versions of the story even added a dramatic flourish of trickery. William, knowing that Harold was a man of dubious moral character, had Harold swear on 2 small caskets. Only after the oath was given did he pull back a cloth to reveal a heap of hidden sacred relics, turning a simple promise into a terrifying, soul-binding sin. Notably, this was the propaganda spread from the Norman side, even though to our modern sensibilities William comes off quite poorly in this telling. William launched a masterful diplomatic and public relations campaign aimed at the most powerful man in Christendom, Pope Alexander II. William sent an embassy to Rome, likely led by his trusted advisor and future Archbishop of Canterbury, Lanfranc. First, they argued King Edward had promised the throne to William. Second, Harold Godwinson had usurped that throne by breaking a holy oath sworn on sacred relics. This part was very important to the Church, as it would have indicated that Godwinson wouldn't have respected the authority of the clergy as King of England. Third, William promised that if he were victorious, he would reform the supposedly corrupt Anglo-Saxon Church and bring it fully in line with Rome. The Pope, who had deep ties with William of Normandy, was convinced. He gave William's invasion his official blessing and, according to the Norman sources, sent a papal banner to be carried at the head of William's army. Historians have noted that the only contemporary source to even mention this holy banner is, once again, William of Poitiers. It's entirely possible the banner story, too, was an invention, created after the victory to retroactively prove that God had been on William's side all along. This brings us to the final fatal flaw in the Norman claim. First, let's assume Harold Godwinson knelt in William's court and swore on every relic in Normandy to give William the throne. Despite this, the oath was, by all legal and theological standards of the day, completely and utterly worthless. First, it was an oath made under duress. Harold was a captive. He had been shipwrecked, imprisoned, and handed over to William. Despite being framed as being a guest of honor, he couldn't leave on his own accord. Medieval canon law, the religious law that governed all of Christendom, was clear on this point. Oaths or promises extracted by force or fear had no validity. Second, and more importantly, Harold had no authority to promise the crown. He was the Earl of Wessex, not the King of England. He couldn't give away a kingdom that was not his to give. Even Edward, who had also allegedly promised the crown to William, ultimately had no such authority. The English crown wasn't a piece of personal property that could be willed away. The Anglo-Saxon monarchy was elective, and the king was chosen by the council of wise men. William, a ruthless and intelligent ruler, knew this. He knew the oath was legally and theologically void, but he also knew that oath-breaker was a powerful, simple, and damning accusation. William could simply repeat this lie over and over again for propagandistic purposes. The genius of the propaganda is that it starts with the assumption that there was a valid oath, reframing the question to be whether Harold was an oath-breaker or not. In the end, history has been much more kind to Harold Godwinson than William the Conqueror was. The scholarly consensus is now uniformly in Godwinson's favor. Even if he did swear such an oath in 1064, he did it under duress, which by the standards of the time was illegal. Further yet, even if he had given the promise under his own free will, this would be the very rough equivalent of the richest man in America promising the presidency to someone. It wouldn't be his to give even if the promise was valid, since there's an elective system in place. In the end, Harold Godwinson wasn't a perjurer. He was the lawfully elected King of England, who died on a battlefield defending his country. Perhaps this is one of the reasons history remembers William of Normandy primarily by the nickname the Conqueror. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with a reminder to hit the notification bell and drop a comment if you haven't done so already. Also, don't forget to check out the YouTube membership or the Patreon if you want to do a bit extra and you're in the financial position to do so. Imagine standing on the walls of Manila in 1586. You're a Spanish soldier, thousands of miles from home, but you feel like a master of the universe. And why wouldn't you? You serve the Spanish Empire at the absolute zenith of its power. In the last 70 years, your countrymen, small, determined bands of conquistadors, have toppled the two largest empires in the New World. They've claimed the entirety of the Americas for your king. Just 6 years ago, in 1580, your monarch, Philip II, also claimed the crown of Portugal, uniting the two greatest global empires of the time. You are in the Philippines, a new colony established in 1565, a precarious, humid perch on the edge of Asia. From here, you look west, across the South China Sea, and there it is, the final prize. The source of the silks and porcelain that fill the galleons, the most populous and wealthiest empire on earth, China. You and your commanders don't just see a trading partner. You see the last, greatest challenge. You see a kingdom ripe for conquest. For a brief, feverish period in the late 16th century, the Empresa de China, or China Enterprise, was a formal proposal submitted to the most powerful man in the world. It was, without a doubt, the most ambitious invasion that never happened. But this plan was born from more than just imperial confidence. It was also a product of a deep-seated identity crisis. The men who settled the Philippines were soldiers, administrators, and missionaries steeped in the conquistador worldview of the Americas. They had come for God, gold, and glory. But the Philippines was a profound disappointment. The archipelago lacked the vast, centralized empires of the Aztecs or Incas. There were no great silver mines, and no golden cities to plunder. Almost immediately, the entire Spanish colony of Manila became utterly dependent on a single source of income: trade. Specifically, acting as merchant middlemen in the Manila galleon trade, swapping silver mined in the Americas for luxury Chinese goods like silk and porcelain. For the Spanish Hidalgo elite, this was a humiliating reality. In their worldview, conquest was king. Trade, by contrast, was seen as a necessary evil to be carried out by less manly peoples than the Spanish. The Empresa de China, therefore, was a psychological necessity. It was a desperate attempt by a frustrated military class to escape the embarrassing reality of being merchants, and in one final glorious campaign, reclaim their very identity as conquistadors. The idea of invading China was an evolving obsession that culminated in two major proposals, each more audacious than the last. It began with the blunt aggression of a governor, and was perfected by the grand strategic fantasy of a Jesuit. The first formal plan came in 1576, not long after the Spanish had settled Manila. It was the brainchild of the new aggressive governor, Francisco de Sande. His predecessor, Guido de Lavazares, had favored peaceful diplomacy, even working with Ming authorities to root out Chinese pirates in the region. But Sande had no patience for diplomacy. He wanted a military solution. In a 1576 letter to King Philip II, Sande laid out his astonishingly bold and astonishingly small plan. He argued that a mere 4,000 to 6,000 Spanish soldiers, properly armed, would be enough to subdue the entire Ming Empire. His justification was based on a profound and, as it turned out, fatal misreading of the evidence. He reported to the king that, quote, "The Chinese are not warriors," and, quote, "do not have good weapons." Sande's entire perception of China was based on the limited, chaotic reports coming from the coastal provinces of Fujian and Guangdong. These provinces at the time were indeed suffering from serious problems with banditry, social unrest, and most famously, rampant piracy. He was committing a classic sampling error, mistaking regional frontier instability for core imperial weakness. He wanted a pretext to invade, so he selectively interpreted local problems as proof that the entire 160 million person empire was feeble. He was, it's clear, completely unaware that, at that very moment, the Ming government under the new Wanli emperor was undergoing significant fiscal and military reforms. King Philip II, a cautious and bureaucratic monarch, received Sande's plan and filed it away, noting that the crown would foster friendship with the Ming dynasty. From there, the idea continued to fester among the conquistadors turned merchants of Manila. A decade later, it roared back to life, championed by an unlikely figure, a Jesuit priest named Alonso Sanchez. Sanchez had been sent from Manila to the royal court in Spain as the colony's official agent. In 1586, he presented a document that contained the definitive, fully formed invasion plan. It was a document of breathtaking scope and almost surreal ambition. Sanchez's plan was far more detailed than Sande's. He called for a massive multinational invasion force. It would be led by 12,000 elite Iberian soldiers, along with 5,000 Christian samurai and 6,000 indigenous Filipino soldiers trained in the Spanish style. The strategy itself was a four-stage geopolitical fantasy straight out of Europa Universalis. First, the Armada would sail from Manila and Macau simultaneously, seizing key ports in the southern coastal provinces of Fujian and Guangdong. Then, in a direct echo of Hernan Cortez's march on Tenochtitlan, the conquistadors and their Japanese allies would then push north to the imperial capital. They would capture the Ming Emperor, at the time, the Wanli Emperor, and install a puppet regime under Spanish control. From there, they would engage in a chillingly systematic phase reminiscent of New World conquests. The Spanish would re-engineer Chinese society. Mass evangelization would convert the population to Catholicism by force. But more importantly, the Spanish would enact a formal policy of encouraging, and perhaps forcing, intermarriage between European men and high-status Chinese women. The goal was to create a new, loyal, Hispanic Chinese elite that would rule the empire in Spain's name as had been done in the New World. From there, China, once pacified, would be the base for world domination. Its vast population would supply the soldiers for a new, unstoppable Sino-Spanish army. This army would then be used to conquer the rest of Asia, march west across the Central Asian steppes, and ultimately conquer the Ottoman Empire from the rear. It's easy to dismiss this as madness, and yet for a time, supposedly rational and experienced men believed it was possible. Their confidence rested on three pillars: a proven blueprint for conquest, dangerously flawed intelligence, and a deep-seated, unshakable belief in their own superiority. The Spanish, quite simply, were prisoners of their own success. The Empresa de China was explicitly modeled on the stunningly successful conquests of the Aztec and Inca empires. In both Mexico and Peru, a few hundred conquistadors had toppled empires of millions. They believed China, as a vast, quote, inefficiently administered empire, would be no different. This belief was reinforced by the stream of flawed intelligence coming from missionaries and ambassadors. The Spanish were told the common people would welcome the invaders as liberators. Missionaries in China even told the Spanish that Chinese children were rebelling against their parents and pleading to be baptized. Notably, the 16th century Spanish tercio undoubtedly was the most feared infantry formation on earth. It was a professional, disciplined, and battle-hardened force that had dominated the battlefields of Europe for a century. This pike and shot formation, mixing long pikes with deadly arquebuses, was seen as invincible. The Spanish believed, as Governor Sandy did, that their combination of steel, gunpowder, and superior tactics simply couldn't be beaten by any non-European force. However, what the Spanish failed to realize is that the Ming Dynasty was a 160 million person strong Iron Age superpower. Even if the Chinese didn't have tercio formations, they had overwhelming numbers and equivalent or superior technologies. Notably, the Spanish perception of a weak, demobilized, and technologically backward Ming Empire was factually, demonstrably false. And the proof is written in the records of the conflicts the Ming were actually fighting while the Spanish were dreaming up their invasion. The Spanish weren't entirely wrong about the Ming's internal politics. Their reports of inefficient administration were pointing to a real phenomenon. The Wanli Emperor, who reigned from 1572 to 1620, was becoming reclusive. Frustrated by bureaucratic squabbles, he effectively went on strike, refusing to attend court, read memorials, or fill critical administrative posts for decades. This did lead to serious political decay and corruption in all other affairs, aside from the military. Despite his growing lack of interest in the affairs of the state, the Wanli Emperor devoted all his time and energy to the military. The Ming bureaucracy, while struggling, was still effective enough to successfully finance and prosecute three major, simultaneous campaigns against its enemies. The greatest of these three campaigns provides the ultimate, devastating counterfactual to the Empresa de China. Incredibly, at virtually the exact same time, another man had the idea that China was weak and could be completely taken over. In 1592, Japan's great unifier, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, decided to conquer China himself. As a first step, he invaded Korea with a battle-hardened army of approximately 160,000 elite warriors. These were men who had come from constant generational conflict. The Ming Empire, viewing Korea as a critical tributary state and a buffer against Japanese aggression, intervened. And the Ming response wasn't that of a demobilized or weak empire. Over the course of the brutal 6-year campaign, the Ming mobilized and deployed a massive, overwhelming force to Korea. The Ming army, fighting alongside their Korean allies, engaged the best soldiers Japan had to offer. They fought them on land and at sea. The Ming scored an overwhelming victory, pushing the Japanese off the continent entirely. The Empresa de China was a passionate, desperate petition from a distant fringe colony. For King Philip II in his palace in Madrid, it was, at best, a distraction from his real problems. In the 1580s, the Spanish Empire was not looking east. It was desperately trying to hold on to its core territories in Europe. The king's treasury and his elite tercios were being bled by the Dutch rebels in the Netherlands. His primary and most hated foe was Protestant England, led by Elizabeth I, which was openly funding those rebels and preying on his treasure fleets in the Atlantic. The year 1588 is the critical date. In March of that year, Philip II, intrigued by Alonso Sanchez's proposal, did sanction a committee to formally study the Empresa de China. The plan was, for a moment, a serious consideration. But just a few months later, in August, Philip's Spanish Armada was defeated. The failure of the Armada was the final unceremonious nail in the coffin for the Empresa de China. Spain couldn't even launch a successful naval invasion against England, let alone hope to storm the beaches of China. The Chinese enterprise went out not with a bang, but with a whimper. Faced with the smoking ruin of his armada in the Atlantic and the endless draining conflict in the Netherlands, he simply stopped patronizing ideas about the plan. In the end, the Spanish Empire's reach had finally exceeded its grasp. Picture an ocean so vast and terrifying that it was known as the Sea of Darkness throughout the medieval Islamic world. To the medieval mind, this was the Atlantic, a churning, fog-shrouded void at the edge of the known world. While scholars in Baghdad or Damascus might write of the Atlantic with a sense of distant dread, for the people of Al-Andalus, it was totally different. It was their western frontier, a source of livelihood for fishermen, a trade route for acquiring tin from Britain, and a battleground where their navies clashed with Viking raiders. The Sea of Darkness was, for them, a familiar, if formidable, neighbor. It's from this world that a once popular, but now virtually unknown story of a pre-Columbian transatlantic voyage emerged. The tale concerns a man named Kash ibn Sa'id ibn Asawad, a Moorish navigator from the vibrant heart of Al-Andalus. In the year 889, Kash allegedly gathered a crew of young men, provisioned a ship, and steered it west, directly into the heart of the unknown ocean. More astonishingly, the story claims that after a long time, he returned. This single fleeting account raises the question of whether this navigator from Iberia crossed the Atlantic in the 9th century, 600 years before Columbus. To understand if a voyage like Kash's was even possible, we have to look at the world he came from. 9th century Al-Andalus was one of the most advanced societies in the world. Its capital, Cordoba, was a sprawling metropolis known as the ornament of the world, a beacon of learning and culture. Cordoba was a city of paved streets, public baths, and magnificent libraries, most famously the library of Caliph al-Hakam II, which reportedly held hundreds of thousands of volumes. This was a place where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars collaborated, translating and building upon the great scientific and philosophical works of the ancient world. This intense intellectual curiosity, this drive to map the world and understand its mechanics, provided a powerful motive for exploration. This motive was matched by sophisticated means. Andalusian maritime technology was state of the art. Sailors had perfected navigational instruments like the astrolabe, a device inherited from the Greeks that could determine latitude by measuring the altitude of stars. They also developed tools like the kamal, an Arab invention from the late 9th century, specifically designed for celestial navigation at sea. Their ships were advanced, often featuring triangular sails that allowed them to tack against the wind far more effectively than the square-rigged vessels common elsewhere. Shipbuilders were also moving toward more advanced hulls, where planks were fitted edge to edge over a frame, creating sleeker, more maneuverable ships. However, that said, these ships were still a far cry from the ships Columbus would sail across the Atlantic over half a millennium later. This technological prowess was also hardened by an arms race. Al-Andalus was under constant threat from Viking raiders. The entire story of Cash rests on a single paragraph in a monumental work of history and geography, The Meadows of Gold and Mines of Gems. Its author was Abu al-Masudi, a brilliant and widely traveled scholar of the 10th century. His work blended together documented history with geography, social commentary, and compelling anecdotes and folklore. In a section discussing the Atlantic, al-Masudi reports that adventurers have braved the ocean, some perishing and others returning. He then provides a specific example. He identifies a man named Cash, an inhabitant of Cordoba, who assembled a group of young men from his city and embarked on a voyage. He specifies that the expedition set sail from the port of what is now Palos de la Frontera. In a somewhat bizarre historical twist, and one that supporters of the plausibility of this mention, is that this is the very same port Columbus would later use. After a long absence, the crew returned with a ship loaded with fabulous booty, and he told of a place that translates from Arabic as unknown land. He then specified that this is a common story told in Andalusia, and says that everyone there, regardless of their religion or background, knows about this story. This final line is perhaps the most historically significant part of the account. It suggests that, regardless of whether the voyage actually happened as described, the story of the voyage was a real and popular piece of 10th century Andalusian culture. The legend itself is a historical artifact, revealing a society that saw itself as capable of conquering the great unknown ocean to its west. The modern debate over Cash hinges not just on the account itself, but on how it has been translated and interpreted. One reading of the account suggests that it isn't even supposed to be taken literally, that this is in essence just a historian relating folklore. In essence, this argument boils down to the portion of the text, which almost reads like starting an English story with "once upon a time." That said, there are other modern historians who challenge whether this phrase had this sort of meaning in al-Masudi's time. As for whether Cash got to North America, the short answer is that there's simply no proof. The story itself doesn't even speak of the specific nature of the lands this supposed explorer found, just that they were rich. The gold standard for establishing pre-Columbian transoceanic contact is tangible, verifiable archaeological evidence. The Norse presence in North America around 1000 is accepted as fact because of the extensive archaeological site at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland. This site undoubtedly contains the remains of their buildings and artifacts, making it impossible to dispute that they were there. The Cash story, compelling as it is, has nothing comparable. There are no 9th century Andalusian artifacts in the Americas, and no American crops or goods in the archaeological record of 9th century Spain. Perhaps most strikingly, there are no other contemporary texts to corroborate al-Masudi's single account. Andalusia had a surprisingly literate culture for a 9th century civilization, and it personally strikes me as unlikely that this event wouldn't have been recorded. It also seems unlikely to me that Islamic Spain, facing a long process of reconquest over the centuries, never decided to send an expedition to find this rich overseas area. Other skeptics believe that the journey wasn't westward, but rather southward past Cape Bojador, the traditional edge of the navigable world. This would place his voyage on par with the earlier voyage of my boy, Hano the Navigator, or the later Portuguese Prince Henry, also nicknamed the Navigator. Notably, this would have provided a much more accessible source of gold and other riches that would have been very rare to completely unknown in Andalusia and in Europe more broadly. Supporters of the theory rest their case on the credibility of al-Masudi and the proven technological capacity of Andalusian sailors. However, without physical evidence, the claim remains firmly in the realm of speculation. Further, there's always the possibility that even if he did sail westward, that he may have run into other Atlantic islands, most likely the Azores, which was then uninhabited. Whether fact or a legend born from a historian's quill or something in between, the tale of the navigator from Cordoba remains a fascinating, unsolved mystery. In 1953, among the vast collections of a British nobleman, a map was rediscovered that sent a quiet shockwave through the world of historical cartography. Hand-painted on a single sheet of parchment in 1424 by a Venetian cartographer named Giovanni Pizzigano, it was a 500-year-old Portolan chart. This is a stunningly practical map of coastlines and ports designed for sailors. It depicted the familiar shores of Western Europe and North Africa with remarkable precision for its time. But out in the vast, empty expanse of the Atlantic, west of the Azores, it showed something impossible. It was a large, nearly perfectly rectangular island, colored a bold, confident red, and labeled Antillia. Interestingly, Antillia wasn't a simple phantom island, but a powerful myth born from the ashes of a fallen kingdom. The story of Antillia begins with a civilizational disaster. In the year 711 AD, the Visigothic kingdom that had ruled the Iberian Peninsula for centuries crumbled under the weight of an invasion by the Umayyad Caliphate. The last Visigothic king, Roderick, fell in battle, and within years, nearly all of what is now Spain and Portugal was under Muslim control. For the Christian population, it was a cataclysm. In the midst of this chaos, a legend of hope was born. The story, told and retold for centuries, centered on 7 Christian bishops who, led by the Archbishop of Porto, refused to submit to the new rulers. Around the year 714, they gathered their parishioners, boarded ships, and sailed west into the unknown Atlantic, a sea of monsters and myth, in search of a new home. According to the legend, they found it. After a perilous voyage, they landed on a large, fertile island where they established a Christian society, founding 7 cities. Each bishop was given the dominion over a city, and accounts even gave these settlements names, like Ira, Antua, and Ansali, lending a veneer of specificity to the tale. But the most crucial detail of the legend was a single dramatic act. Upon their arrival, the bishops ordered their ships to be burned. This was the point of no return. It transformed their desperate flight into a deliberate, permanent act of creation. They were no longer exiles, but founders, severing all ties to a homeland now lost to them. This story was a cultural and religious coping mechanism. In the face of civilizational collapse, it offered a narrative of continuity and divine sanction. It created an idealized Christian Visigothic Iberia that was safe, ordered, and pure, a stark contrast to the chaos of their conquered home. For 700 years, the story of the 7 bishops and their island sanctuary remained a powerful oral tradition. Then, in the 15th century, it took physical form. The 1424 Pizzigano chart gave Antillia its first known address, placing it firmly in the Atlantic. Its depiction was bizarre. Real islands aren't perfect rectangles, yet there it was, an impossibly geometric shape floating in the ocean. It was accompanied by a smaller archipelago, most notably a large blue rectangle to its north ominously named Satanazes, or the Isle of Devils. This pairing created a powerful symbolic geography in the middle of the ocean, a holy Christian sanctuary existing in direct opposition to a demonic, dangerous place. What's remarkable is that for the next 70 years, this strange depiction was copied by Europe's best map makers. Dozens of cartographers copied this Antillia group, along with the Devil Island, as if they were real places. This uniformity suggests they weren't plotting independent sightings, but were all working from a single, authoritative source that had become an accepted fact within the cartographic tradition. The name itself, Antillia, is widely believed to derive from the Portuguese ante ilha, meaning opposite island. This, combined with its rectangular shape, so similar to the outline of Portugal itself, has led many scholars to conclude that it was a symbolic projection. It was a piece of Portugal placed in the middle of the Atlantic. A phantom island on a map might seem like a historical curiosity, but Antillia had a very real impact on the world. During the 15th century, the legend transitioned from folklore to state policy. Portuguese monarchs, hungry for new lands and trade routes, treated Antillia as a plausible, even probable target for discovery. In a royal letter from 1475, King Afonso V granted the knight Fernão Teles the rights to the island and any other populated islands he might find in the western Atlantic. A decade later, in 1486, King John II issued a similar grant, authorizing another explorer to discover the island of 7 cities, a clear reference to Antillia. After 1492, as European ships began to crisscross the Atlantic, a problem emerged. Antillia wasn't where the maps said it was. Explorers charted the Caribbean, finding a vast archipelago of islands, but no trace of 7 Visigothic cities. The legend, however, was too powerful to just disappear. Its name was simply applied to the newly discovered islands, the modern Antilles, a place name marking where the myth was potentially supposed to be. The core concept of the 7 cities, meanwhile, proved just as resilient. It detached itself from its island host and migrated, projecting itself onto the vast, unexplored mainland of North America. The legend also mutated. The focus shifted from a pious Christian refuge to rumors of unimaginable material wealth. As the Spanish conquered the Aztecs, the rumored cities became the 7 cities of gold, thought to be located in the American Southwest. These 7 cities of gold represented an early fusion of Spanish and Aztec myth-making. As the 16th century progressed and transatlantic navigation became routine, the space on the map for Antillia simply vanished. It was initially speculated that the islands could be something smaller than was imagined, and could still be out there in the Atlantic. However, increased traffic and more accurate charting provided overwhelming negative evidence, and the idea of this island disappeared. The modern consensus is clear. Antillia was a phantom island, but there is one more question surrounding it. Some believe that Giovanni Pizzigano had simply added it based on a misunderstanding of the Azores. For reference, the Azores were first permanently settled by the Portuguese, and that may indicate why there was a Portugal shape representing it. Others have proposed that it potentially represented Bermuda, though this island wouldn't be discovered until the early 16th century. Its origin remains an ongoing subject of debate amongst scholars. Perhaps it's a garbled account of a real place like the Azores, a cartographic error copied for decades, or just a purely symbolic representation of hope. Whatever the case, the name Antillia is now immortalized in the archipelago of islands in the Caribbean. Every year, thousands of pilgrims travel to the St. Thomas Church in Leipzig, Germany, drawn by the promise of standing in the presence of genius. They gather in the church's chancel, where a large bronze plaque set into the floor marks the grave of Johann Sebastian Bach. It's a solemn, powerful experience to be so close to the man who composed some of the most sublime music in human history. But this hallowed ground is built on a foundation of historical ambiguity, 19th century nationalistic fervor, and scientific theories that have long since crumbled. In a surprising twist, the skeleton beneath the floor may not be Bach at all, and the story of how it got there is a winding, century-and-a-half-long mystery. The story begins not with reverence but with neglect. When Johann Sebastian Bach died from a stroke on July 28, 1750, he was a respected local figure in Leipzig. He was a brilliant organist and former music director, but he wasn't widely known throughout Europe or even the Holy Roman Empire. 3 days after his death, his body was placed in an oak coffin and buried without ceremony in the Johannes Friedhof, the old St. John's Cemetery, just outside the city walls. Like most burials of the era, his grave was left unmarked, and within a few years, its exact location had been completely forgotten. The Johannes Friedhof was a poor choice for a lasting memorial. Established in the 13th century as a burial ground for a leper hospital, it was a chaotic, overcrowded space with a turbulent history. It had been used as a military camp during Napoleon's time, with soldiers reportedly burning old coffins for firewood. Locating a single, unmarked grave from 150 years prior seemed like an impossible task. Yet 2 fragile clues survived. The first was an archival note indicating Bach was buried in an oak coffin, a distinction given to only 12 of the 1,400 people who died in Leipzig that year. The second was a piece of oral tradition that only surfaced around the time of the search itself in 1894. It claimed Bach's grave was located 6 paces from the south door of St. John's Church. This tradition, however, was incredibly tenuous, originating from a 75-year-old man who said he'd been told the spot 60 years earlier by a 90-year-old gardener. Nobody else amongst the living had remembered this so-called tradition, aside from this one old man. By the late 19th century, a full-blown Bach revival was sweeping across Europe. Composers like Mendelssohn had championed his work, transforming him from a respected but somewhat obscure Baroque master into a German national hero. From there, his fame quickly rose outside his native land, and he quickly became accepted as one of the most talented composers in history. Musical pilgrims flocked to Leipzig, but there was no grave to visit, no central shrine for their adoration. The planned rebuilding of the Johanneskirche in 1894 provided the perfect opportunity to rectify this. A committee was formed, driven by civic and national pride, to find the composer's lost remains. The excavation that began in October 1894 was anything but a scientific undertaking. In fact, it looks like the team in charge took the notes from Heinrich Schliemann and applied them to this German archaeological site. Wilhelm Hiss, a professor of anatomy leading the effort, described the scene as a muddy pit filled with a heap of bones. After finding and discarding several pine coffins, they unearthed 3 oak caskets. The first contained a young woman. The second oak coffin was accidentally smashed to pieces by an overzealous excavator. But the third, found on October 22nd, held the well-preserved skeleton of an elderly man. In an environment of immense expectation, the conclusion was immediate and decisive. This had to be Bach. The search was driven not by impartial inquiry, but by a fervent desire for success, making it highly susceptible to confirmation bias. With a candidate skeleton secured, the task of proving its identity fell to science, or what passed for it at the time. Wilhelm His took the lead, focusing his analysis on the skull, and offered the most 19th century scientific explanation you can imagine. He declared the skull had sturdy and strong features, befitting a man of distinction, or what modern observers call the argument from Giga-Chaddism. All joking aside, though, known depictions from Bach's life do depict him as a bit of a Chad, so perhaps not the worst argument of all time given the person involved. His even argued that certain features of the temporal bone suggested a highly developed sense of hearing, a trait one might expect in a great composer. This claim was called out by other experts even at the time, so he resorted to other ways to scientifically prove Bach was in the bones. He then commissioned a sculptor to quote-unquote recreate what the skull looked like in life, using known portraits of Bach as a guide during the process. Unsurprisingly, the bust came out looking entirely like the great composer himself. This logic was entirely circular. The reconstruction looked like Bach because it was made to look like Bach, because it was done with reference to the great master. Half a century later, the bones were examined again before their final move. This time, a surgeon named Wolfgang Rosenthal noticed something new. He found abnormal bony growths, or exostoses, on the skeleton's pelvis and at muscle attachment points on the arms. He hypothesized that these were the result of occupational stress from a lifetime of playing the organ, a physically demanding activity involving repetitive foot and arm movements. To test his theory, he X-rayed 11 living professional organists and claimed they all showed similar growths. He proudly announced the discovery of a new ailment, Organistenkrankheit, or organist's disease, and declared the skeleton's identity confirmed beyond doubt. I know this might be trite to say, but I really do love how in German, you can just easily create a new, insanely specific word by cobbling a bunch of different words together. Like Wilhelm His's theory, Rosenthal's was a compelling story, but it was also proven to be wrong. In a 2007 study published in the Medical Journal of Australia, researchers replicated his experiment, but added a crucial element: a control group of non-musicians. Their findings dismantled the theory completely. Only a third of the organists had the bony growths, while 75% of the non-organ playing control group did. The growths were simply common signs of aging and physical activity, not a unique marker of organists. Rosenthal's irreproducible disease was discredited, removing the last piece of supposed scientific evidence for the skeleton's identity. But let's get back to what happened after the bones were quote-unquote proved to be those of Bach. Despite the shaky identification, the bones were treated as sacred relics to one of the most talented people in history. In 1900, they were placed in a grand stone sarcophagus and interred in a crypt beneath the altar of the rebuilt St. John's Church. On December 4th, 1943, Allied bombs rained down on Leipzig, and St. John's was destroyed. In a twist of fate that only deepened the legend, the crypt somehow survived the inferno, and the sarcophagus was recovered from the ruins in 1949, its contents unharmed. This miraculous preservation set the stage for the final chapter of their journey. On July 28, 1950, the 200th anniversary of Bach's death, the remains were moved to their present location in St. Thomas Church. This is the very place where Bach had worked as music director for 27 years. The reinterment was a major state event in what was then East Germany, with the new bronze grave cover sponsored by the Soviet Union. This was a political act that claimed Bach's legacy for the new regime and was implicitly an act of reconciliation between the Soviets and their new German satellite state. Today, there is no scientific consensus that the remains in St. Thomas Church are those of Johann Sebastian Bach. In fact, most modern assessments conclude that it's highly unlikely. The entire case rests on a chain of weak links: a dubious oral tradition, a chaotic and biased excavation, and two discredited scientific theories. By the standards of modern forensic anthropology, the identification process of 1894 was appallingly inadequate, lacking proper documentation, site mapping, or a chain of custody. There is one tool that could likely solve this mystery for good: genetic analysis. A comparison between DNA extracted from the skeleton and that from the known remains of one of Bach's sons could provide a definitive answer. While analyzing antique DNA is challenging due to degradation and contamination, modern techniques are increasingly capable of such feats. Yet, no test has ever been done. To date, the church authorities at St. Thomas have refused all requests for DNA analysis, including a formal scientific proposal. And so, the mystery endures. The skeleton in the chancel of St. Thomas Church remains a powerful symbol, a physical link to a transcendent artist. But whether it is a true relic or simply the anonymous remains of a Leipzig citizen caught up in a story of national pride, we may never know. Perhaps in the end, it doesn't matter. Bach's true, incorruptible remains aren't buried in Leipzig. They're encoded in the notes of the Mass in B minor and the Brandenburg Concertos, among numerous other works, a legacy that needs no bones to prove its immortality. Close your eyes for a moment and listen. Not to the world you know, but to a world that's been silent for over 300 years. Imagine the sound of the island of Mauritius before humans. It's a symphony of buzzing insects, the rustle of giant tortoises through dense undergrowth, the calls of brightly colored parrots in trees. There's one very unusual noise, though: the pigeon-like coo of a large flightless bird, foraging for fallen fruit on the forest floor. This was the world of the dodo, an ecosystem that evolved in splendid isolation for millions of years. Now, listen again. That symphony is gone. In its place is a profound silence, a quiet defined by the absence of its most famous resident. The story of the dodo isn't the simple fable you might remember from childhood, the tale of a stupid bird that was too clumsy to survive. It's a far more complex and tragic story of a creature perfectly adapted to one world and catastrophically unprepared for the new one that arrived. Mauritius is a volcanic island, a lonely peak thrust up from the floor of the Indian Ocean, never connected to any mainland. This isolation was the master architect of its unique ecology. Before human settlement, it was a paradise cloaked in a mosaic of forests, from dry coastal woods to misty upland cloud forests, interspersed with palm-rich savannas. The most crucial feature of this world was what it lacked: terrestrial mammalian predators. With no large carnivores stalking the forest floor, the island's fauna evolved along a different path. Giant tortoises and skinks roamed freely, and the only native mammals were friendly bats that had made the perilous journey over the ocean there. In this sanctuary, the dodo's ancestors, pigeons that likely arrived from Southeast Asia millions of years ago, found an environment where their old adaptations were no longer necessary. Flying is an incredibly energy-intensive activity, a biological luxury maintained for escaping predators or finding scarce food. On Mauritius, food was abundant on the ground, and there was nothing to escape from ever. So, over countless generations, the dodo's ancestors traded the sky for the ground. Their wings shrank, their bodies grew larger and more robust. Similarly, their reproductive strategy adapted to this life of safety. With no predators to raid their nests, female dodos laid only a single, large egg at a time. This allowed them to invest all their energy into one promising offspring, rather than simply blasting out as many eggs as possible and hoping one chick survives. The traits that would later be seen as flaws, flightlessness, largeness, and a low birth rate, weren't flaws at all. They were the pinnacle of evolutionary success in the peaceful world the dodo had always known. You might not like it, but this is what peak bird physiology looks like. The popular image of the dodo is a caricature, a comically fat, clumsy, and dim-witted bird. This picture, largely shaped by 17th century European artists like Roland Savory, painting overfed captive specimens, is almost entirely wrong. And in case you're one of those people who just listens, now would be the time to look. I'm sure this painting is familiar to many of you. Modern analysis of the dodo's skeletal structure reveals a bird that wasn't obese but athletic and robust, with strong legs capable of navigating the island's uneven terrain. In the wild, it likely weighed up to 40 pounds and was far leaner than the caricatures suggest. It also stood about 3.5 feet tall and was a powerful ground dweller perfectly suited to its niche. Its mind, too, has been unfairly maligned. The idea of the dumb dodo is likely a myth. For those of you who aren't native English speakers, dumb as a dodo is a fairly common phrase, meaning that someone is, well, exceedingly stupid. In 2016, scientists discovered that its brain-to-body size ratio was on par with that of a modern pigeon, a bird known for its intelligence and trainability. Even more revealing was the structure of its brain. Unlike most birds, which have large optic lobes for keen eyesight, the dodo had an unusually large and well-developed olfactory bulb. This strongly suggests that the dodo navigated its world not primarily by sight, but by smell, sniffing out the fallen fruits, nuts, and roots that made up its diet on the dark forest floor. Yet for all its successful adaptations, its reproductive strategy, that single precious egg laid in a simple nest of grass on the ground, would be its Achilles heel. The end began not with a bang, but with the creak of timber and the splash of an anchor. While Portuguese sailors may have been the first Europeans to glimpse Mauritius around 1507, the pivotal moment came in 1598, with the arrival of Dutch ships. Having evolved for millennia without fear of predators, the dodos were innately trusting and easily approached, making them simple targets for hungry sailors. But the common idea that humans simply hunted the dodo to extinction is too simple. While hunting certainly contributed, several accounts from sailors noted that dodo meat was tough, greasy, and just generally disgusting. The direct human hunt was just the opening act of a much larger ecological tragedy. The true devastation was an invasion, silent and insidious. The Dutch ships brought with them a host of stowaways and livestock that were alien to Mauritius: rats, pigs, dogs, cats, and monkeys. In an environment with no natural predators of their own, these invasive species exploded in number. They were perfectly equipped to exploit the dodo's greatest vulnerability, its single egg, laid defenseless on the forest floor. A single hungry pig could wipe out the reproductive efforts of an entire dodo population far more efficiently than a crew of sailors ever could. This biological assault was compounded by the physical destruction of the dodo's world. The Dutch began systematically felling the island's ancient forests, seeking valuable ebony wood for export to Europe and clearing land for settlements. This habitat destruction fragmented the remaining dodo populations, squeezing them into ever smaller pockets, where they were even more vulnerable to the new predators. Simply put, the dodo faced a three-pronged attack of hunting, invasive predators, and habitat loss that unraveled an ecosystem in less than a century. Pinpointing the exact moment the last dodo perished is a forensic analysis clouded by the fog of history. The last universally accepted sighting of a living dodo was made in 1662 by a shipwrecked Dutch sailor named Volkert Everts. He and his companions found the birds not on the main island, but on a small offshore islet, a telling detail that suggests the species had already been wiped out on the main island. After that, the trail goes cold, complicated by a case of mistaken identity and several later accounts which mention sightings of dodos into the 1670s and 1680s. However, linguistic and historical analysis suggests that as the true dodo disappeared, settlers transferred its familiar name to another flightless bird. This creature, called the red rail, is also now extinct, but without a clear physical description, these later textual references are ambiguous. But notably, modern science and statistical techniques have offered a new tool to peer into the silence and figure out when the dodo went extinct. In 2003, researchers applied a statistical method called optimal linear estimation to the known record of dodo sightings. By analyzing the decreasing frequency of reliable observations, the model calculated the statistical probability of the species' survival over time. The conclusion was that the dodo likely persisted, unseen and dwindling, for another generation after the 1662 encounter, and they arrived at a date of 1690 as most probable. Whatever the case, the last dodo perished alone, a century after its tropical Garden of Eden was shattered.